All right. Good morning, everyone from sunny and very hot South Carolina in the United States. I hope everyone in the global DME for Peace community is having had a happy Thursday. Welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks, where we aim to bring you the best and most innovative learning there is in the peace building field and beyond. My name is Jennifer Howell, and I am the Senior Communications Associate for DME for Peace at Search for Common Ground. Similar to many of you, I am working from my home office, formerly known as my kitchen table. I'll be taking over as moderator this session. So today we are focusing on safer data collection for peace building. I am delighted to welcome Cooper of Dobility and Survey C. Thanks for joining us today and for leading our discussion. Note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar deck, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A portion. I'll now hand over to today's guest, Amrik. You're very welcome, and the floor is yours. Great. And sorry, Amrik, I just saw your message about my audio cutting in and out. That might be when people are joining. I'll try to get it fixed during your presentation. My apologies to everyone. Patience. All right,
no worries. Great, thanks, Jennifer. I hope I am audible, but please just let us know if you have any issues with seeing the slides or hearing me through the presentation. So, hi everyone. As Jennifer was explaining, my name is Amrik. I am the Director of Customer Success at Dobility, and we are the makers of a data collection platform called Survey CTO. I'm here to talk to you about safer data collection for peace building and development. The team at Dobility have been working hard this year to help the people we serve adapt to the realities of COVID-19, and there are a number of actionable pieces of advice we'd like to share with you that might help. And the advice I'll share today is intended to be cross-cutting, applicable regardless of the technology choices that you make. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Survey CTO, it might help to contextualize the problems we focus on, a little through looking at some of our major users. Our users are varied, including academic researchers, research organizations that need to do rigorous impact evaluation, nonprofits, government ministries, and other institutions who have historically sent out field research teams to conduct face-to-face interviews. All of these organizations have had to adapt to their current circumstances, finding new ways to collect data more safely. So with that context, I just want to give a quick overview of the content of our presentation today. We're going to have a look at these topics. The first I'll talk to you about is decentralizing data collection, covering adjustments you might make to data collection processes to keep people safe. I'd also like to discuss systems you can set up using software tools to help you manage the process of conducting phone interviews and tracking what's going on with a phone survey. Lastly, I'll also speak briefly about things you can do to help ensure the best possible data quality outcomes, including taking advantage of experienced field supervisors and automatic quality checks, which are possible to run on your data. So, to start things off, I'll speak to you briefly about decentralizing data collection. For those of us who primary data collection from in-person, for those of us who collect primary data from in-person interviews, this year has obviously been a tough one, a learning experience. Many organizations put field work on hold, or did it first, tried to postpone it, but getting back to normal is clearly not really an option. So if your work in the field is important, and I'm convinced that it is, you're either in the process of making a plan to adapt, or you already have, and you're looking to improve that reaction to our circumstances. So part of that is looking for new data collection methods. And there are various options which might be appropriate depending on resources and the use cases that you're looking to satisfy. A lot of the major options people are considering are computer-assisted telephone interviewing, web surveying, SMS surveys, and interactive voice recognition. I'll be focused on computer-assisted telephone interviewing in this presentation, using examples that come from Kathy. Briefly, interviewer-mediated interviews, whether face-to-face or over the phone, are generally more appropriate for questionnaires over a certain length, or questionnaires that are detailed to a certain extent that make other methods just a little bit unsuitable given the content. I'll also make the argument, which I'm happy to defend later, that interviewers can actually be your allies in achieving higher quality data, more so than being liabilities. So, decentralized deployment. Assuming that your alternative data collection does involve a team on the ground, interviewers, for example, you'll need to get your team prepared for the work ahead. But what's involved in that? Well, the broader concept or pieces of decentralized deployment are getting your research team up to speed with what they need to know, equipping them with equipment like phones and computers, and making sure that they're set up and confident with the software that they'll need to be using to be part of your remote data collection system. So obviously, if you don't really have a team, you would need to recruit remotely, but the concept of doing interviews over the phone or video calls is not a new one. Similarly, I think many people who work in the peacebuilding and development space often work with local partners and service providers who are often a source of people from the right backgrounds in the country that you're working in. So a lot of that is not so different from the pre-COVID world. What is more challenging is training. It's obviously difficult and well, ill-advised, to say the least, to organize group training sessions. So the coping mechanism is to typically take training online, but this is internet dependent. And there are different strategies you can use about how to optimize your approach to training depending on the internet connections that people receiving training will have. The safest strategy is definitely to shoot for optimization for low connectivity scenarios. Not everybody on the other end will have super fast connection, and obviously data services to SIM cards can be quite expensive in some countries as well. So that's another challenge. So you might think about, rather than live Zoom training sessions, you might think about pre-recorded presentations where you send a link so the presentation can buffer locally and people can watch it at their own pace. You might think about slide decks designed to be independent training tools that allow attendees or trainees to make their own progress through the slide deck at their own pace. So lots of things like that can be helpful. Another critical thing, which is actually not different at all from the pre-COVID world in my mind, is that knowledge testing. and assessment following training is really crucial. If you're going to train a group of phone interviewers on the content of a study, but also the protocol to be followed, you really want to be sure that everybody understands what is required before they begin the work that they do. On training, I actually have a great anecdote to share. On the last webinar, we convened with some guests, Young Love from Botswana, who are an education NGO. They pivoted very quickly to the new circumstances and worked out a way to continue their programming during Botswana's lockdown. They were able to capacitate their program facilitators to do the work that was required using WhatsApp chat groups as training spaces. So a handful of facilitators would be added to a WhatsApp group. Various content, including singular slides saved as images, would be shared, pre-prepared sections of text. They would use voice notes as well as a training mechanism for both sharing information, but also for each participant in the training group to record sections of a mock interview explaining what, or rather demonstrating how they would go about something. So it was really a very innovative use of an existing tool adapted for a new purpose, and this has reportedly worked very well for them, which was very nice to hear. Aside from training, something else that is important is equipment. I mean, I won't spend much time talking about the value and importance of digital data collection, but it is very advantageous. So to do that, you will need certain equipment, and it is possible to limit contact by asking enumerators or interviewers to use the equipment that they have on hand, assuming it works with the software that you'd like to use. But that does pose some respondent privacy issues, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But for countries or cities experiencing travel restrictions or lockdowns, there's often not much of a better choice if you are delivering a critical program or level of support. So you might just have to make some compromises where you can. However, if you're not facing those restrictions, it's definitely possible to make a safe enough plan to at least distribute equipment to team members, which also has advantages in that you can set up all the software correctly, and you don't necessarily need to train on the setup. But on the flip side, it is possible to think about picking a software system that has easy setup for remote teams in mind. Some systems may have quick configuration options to allow data collectors to get their software quickly set up how you intend. So that's something to think about in your technology choices. Sorry, I went a little bit too quickly past that slide. So I want to talk to you a little bit about phone survey tools. And by phone survey tools, I'm talking about the software system that helps you manage the process of running a computer-assisted telephone interviewing survey. There are many approaches to phone surveys. If you have the resources, you could always outsource the work to a professional call center, which can be a great choice if you have the resources and if the trade-offs are not a problem for you. The professional call centers do involve, well, a few compromises, and depending on the sort of data you're collecting and your data quality standards, some of these will be more or less tenable. But if you are used to managing your own research and want to be involved in the day-to-day of what's happening with your projects, you'll probably want to manage CATI yourself. So if you are managing a phone survey yourself, you will need a system to manage the process of making contact attempts. This is in addition to the explicit questions you actually want answered during the interview. So understanding the series of events that took place to get in contact with a respondent is part of assembling a credible evidence base to verify the interview. So this data, I would argue, is actually as important as the explicit questions you're asking. So this means recording contact attempts even when no one picks up, counting how many times these sorts of events happen, but also taking record of scheduled appointments or plans to call back, because those are part of your strategy for promoting a certain level of response, which you'll need to deal with attrition. So obviously phone calls have all sorts of possible outcomes when you dial a phone number, and for this reason we suggest that your CAFE system logs all of this so it can be reviewed, hopefully as soon after these events take place in the field, because this is the way that you can manage a team who are working remotely from home, who you don't see, who aren't being actively supervised by a team of supervisors. So just keep that in mind. Otherwise, there are lots of things that actually just don't change with phone interviews. Informed consent obviously is a standard today in all social science research. Depending on IRB requirements and the sensitivity of the topic, different approaches might work. A common approach with face-to-face interviews is having enumerators read a consent statement and recording in the data the answer to that question about whether consent is provided. But you have some other options as well. If you are recording calls, you can record the response that the respondent makes to the consent statement, so it can be listened to and verified. It's also possible to record consent using SMS. Bulk SMS services are actually fantastic complements to telephone surveys. So as an aside, just to substantiate that, SMSs can do all sorts of things which help promote response rates. SMS messages can provide advance notice of interviews to take place, but they can also be useful for disseminating information to beneficiaries and research subjects. So it can actually be quite complementary whether you're delivering a program or conducting some sort of research. So as an example, a survey CTO user organization, Innovations for Poverty Action, who you may be familiar with, they've been using bulk SMS services to establish treatment and control groups, so that the treatment would get certain information that the control wouldn't, and phone calls would occur to find out more about the effectiveness of the information that's being shared, and obviously whether it was received. But again, what's also really useful about messaging in this way is it helps to promote response. And of course, another thing that just doesn't change with phone interviews is you do need to confirm that you're speaking to the right person. And that is a little harder when you are not there in person. But if you have enough information about your respondents, and you are able to verify all of that information when you speak to them, you shouldn't have an issue confirming the right people. So, all right, so that's a little bit about CATI systems. I'm sure that still leaves some questions. As part of CADI systems, call recording is generally a great way to manage interview quality. And depending on your CATI system or tools, phone call recording might be a feature that's supported by that software. But it also might not be. Anybody who's shopped around for complex software platforms knows that there are trade-offs when you try to pursue an all-in-one offering that seems to do everything, versus looking at integrating the best of a set of tools, which together serve the same purpose. So in the latter situation, I mean, you might consider some sort of integration with a programmable voice API service. And two examples that we've gotten some experience of in the past couple of months are platforms called Twilio and Exetel. Exetel happens to be limited to India for voice services, but many projects that we're familiar with are running and doing a lot of quality control using Exetel in India. So services like these have advantages in that they offer a greater deal of respondent privacy. That is because using services like Twilio and Exetel allows you to mask phone numbers. For example, if you've ever dealt with a service like Uber or similar, you'll notice that the phone numbers that these services use, it's never actually, you'll never actually see the phone number of a driver and vice versa. It's always masked using a virtual phone number owned by that company, and you can support phone surveys in a similar way, which also allows you to pretty safely, without many concerns, have phone interviewers use their personal phones even, because the phone numbers of respondents would never actually be exposed to your survey team. So that's something to think about. And also, if you're operating at scale, programmable services like this also have bulk call rates, non-profit pricing. So there are a number of good things about this route. The broad advice I will give you about call recording is to be strategic about what you record and listen to. So for most research teams, it's just too much effort to be listening to every minute of every call. So you might be recording everything just in case, but even in that scenario, you'll want to work out a plan for choosing which call recordings to listen to and choosing which parts of the interview to focus on. You might have a purposive strategy for this, but randomization is also your friend. If you make random determinations to flag sections of interviews or specific parts of interviews and those interviews recordings that you want to focus on and listen to, that is a great strategy which you can use to limit the effort and still be on the ball with quality. So on the topic of quality, let's just talk about dashboards. Well, dashboards and metadata, I suppose. So one of the great things about digital data collection is the range of metadata values that are available from digital forms. This was also true, just by the way, with face-to-face interviews. So digital forms can include things like timestamps and information about the conditions under which the form was filled out. And all of this is a first and very superficial layer of your data quality control. But if you are running CATI surveys, ideally your software would offer you additional metadata about calls. So for example, did a call take place at all? To which phone numbers? How long were the calls that took place while the form was open. These are all, I think, really important but easy to scrutinize pieces of data that tell you a lot about data quality. So I would definitely recommend thinking about features like this when you are designing or looking for a CATI project management system. So otherwise, aside from metadata, small segue, I spoke about supervisors earlier. So many teams and organizations who have historically maintained face-to-face field operations. One of the linchpins of your activities will be field supervisors, who are historically invaluable allies that help keep projects on course, guiding enumerators, performing quality control functions in the field. And that's typically done by sitting in during interviews to be a presence for support, but also for quality control. And obviously, supervisors can't be traveling to the homes or remote locations of where phone interviewers are working, but there are good options that you can still pursue. So basically, most modern cell phones support call conferencing. For anybody who's not done this, the way that it works is you start one phone call with a first person, and then there's generally a plus button on the call management interface. So you tap that button and you would add another call, which places the first call on mute. Then there'll be another button in the interface for merging the two phone calls. So you can use this functionality to undertake what we would call remote accompaniment. So first, it makes sense to get the supervisor on the line, and the supervisor mutes themselves, and the enumerator will try to patch in a respondent and will merge the calls once somebody answers on the other side. And that way, the supervisor can listen in, provide feedback, and interviews can be followed by a short debrief to talk about how things might be better next time. So supervisors can still be very useful in the context of CATI interviews. Lastly, I wanted to talk just a little bit about data visualization. I mean, it's I suppose quite fashionable in general, but it's something we encourage. Dashboards can be very helpful, and one of my suggestions is to focus on enumerator performance statistics. So you can see how enumerators are doing in aggregate in comparison to each other. Really, in this respect, there's no difference with face-to-face interviews, except that you will want to focus on some call-related metadata if present. For example, aggregating call duration would be a really useful basic statistic, because you'll know roughly how long your interview should take place. It should take if it was completed. So depending on a little bit further, depending on your analysis or visualization software of choice, phone call related data could also be checked automatically. So just as an example, lots of survey CTO users enjoy and prefer using the Stata data analysis software package, which happens to be scriptable. So it's possible to pre-prepare steps to evaluate data as it's coming in. And other software systems and tools also have ways of flagging records automatically based on thresholds and checks that you set up. So it's something to consider, to keep in mind as you design the ways that you look at your data. So As an example of something that you might consider, I mean, it's something that we've blogged about a couple of times. Perhaps you use the Google suite of productivity applications. One of those options is Google Sheets. If you are able to publish data to Google Sheets, you can build spreadsheet dashboards with familiar functions. Generally, spreadsheet dashboards are quite useful because many teams have good literacy when it comes to spreadsheets. So it's something to think about. This is just an example of something that we put together. So a quick summary of what's been going on so far, the status of different calls over time, and of course you'd be interested in the performance of agents. You can also see the spread of cases assigned to agents, so you can see who's behind and who's ahead. So this was just a quick idea in case you didn't have that in mind. But yeah, that's more or less what I had come to discuss with you today. Hopefully some of this inspires some action, some revisions, but I think, yeah, it's about time to enter the Q&A portion of the presentation. So Jennifer, maybe we can move on to Q&A.
Sure, no problem. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Amrik. Again, apologies if I go in and out a little bit. It's just my go-to webinar system right now. But and if you have any questions or if you can't hear something, please send it in to the question function. I'm reading everything there. So you can send your questions in there, but also if you can't hear me, let me know. So much that was full. So now is the time that we're entering our Q&A portion. We will open up today's presentation to questions. A couple of notes about that. Those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday talks, you can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question function. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, which will allow us to unmute your so that you can ask your questions live. When you submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation if possible, just it to you. Apologies in advance if I say your name. I'll try my best, but sometimes it's difficult. Just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace so that those who were not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation. While everyone is sending in their questions, well, actually, it looks like we have a few coming in already. Thank you all so much. I also want to point out that I sent links in the chat function during the presentation. These were given to me by Amrik, and he thought they might be something that you'd be interested looking into after this webinar. So I will also include those in the recording, so don't worry about that when we post it on our website later today. So let's get started with our questions. Our first question comes from Zumrat. What are the most important ethical challenges that you have seen, Amrik?
So I'll interpret that as in the context of telephone survey. I assume that's the right framing, but let us know if that's not right.
Yes, let us know. Send it in. Sorry, let us know. Send it in if that is not the frame that you're talking about. Thank you so much.
So I'll start speaking about that thing, as that was my focus. So I think one of the key challenges in terms of ethical concerns to take care of is what I mentioned about making sure that you properly respect respondent that you look after your obligations in terms of protecting personally identifying information like phone numbers. So one of the challenges with phone surveys, if you are doing them on a very basic level, enumerators do have access to all sorts of personally identifying information, including contact details now. Now, I mean, of course, with face-to-face surveys, previously you had to supply similar information, often the same information and more. But still, there's still a degree of due diligence that's required. And one of the things you can do is mask phone numbers. So again, just briefly, what that means is in the background, the two people are being connected, but neither can see each other's phone number. That is an inconvenience sometimes, because sometimes you get disconnected, and it'll take a couple more steps to reconnect. And even in the unlikely event that the respondent is super helpful and wants to try and call back to finish the interview, it's just not something they'll be able to do if they're calling back to a virtual number. But privacy and protection of personally identifying information and contact information is probably the most key aspect. But there are other ethical considerations, but they depend. So protecting that information is probably the most generic aspect, but depending on the subject material that you're covering, and I'll give some examples. You may have some ethical considerations about asking certain questions over the phone. Some of this is culturally and country specific, but if, for example, a topic that's been generally sensitive has to do with abuse of women and children, and autonomy and decision-making power of women. So in very patriarchal cultures where women have less autonomy, men might by nature be a little bit curious about who's calling for their wife, what sort of questions they're asking. So you might be interested in asking certain questions about your respondents' autonomy, about their decision-making power, but some of these questions might be culturally bounded and may not be things that male household members will really respond well to. So you'll want to think twice about asking questions that can create conflicts and challenges for your respondents. So that's a very serious ethical issue, but there are ways of handling that. They're not necessarily foolproof, but you can ask, for example, who's in the room while interviews are taking place. You can ask if it is safe to talk in certain ways. You can also suggest coded responses. So a non-response might mean something, and you might rehearse the non-response versus something verbal, whatever that alternative response is. So there are ways of asking a lot of these questions, but you need to think quite carefully about the risks for respondents and the importance of those questions for you. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yes, thank you. If I can add on to that, we have a question regarding supervision. Do you inform a respondent about that supervisors are listening in to the interview call? Would you recommend that, or?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure everybody has dealt with call centers often enough to have heard either a recorded message or a human being saying, sometimes we're working under supervision, and this call might be recorded for quality assurance purposes. This really isn't so different. You may not actually be familiar with the legal restrictions and requirements for conducting any sort of phone outreach operation in the country that you're looking to operate in. But lots of these stipulations and warnings are actually legal requirements in places. So you do need to get clued up on those sorts of things, and but also just as an ethical consideration, I would say it's good form to explain that someone else is listening for quality assurance purposes. I would definitely recommend it.
Great, thank you. We have a couple questions actually surrounding, especially now it's very important with the pandemic going on. We've had a few people ask, what way can CADI function in the context without there being telecom or data services, as in for like hard to reach locations that don't offer this? What's the best way a survey can be conducted? How can CADI function? Everything around kind of using this in locations with low connectivity and data services.
So that is an excellent question. I haven't spoken to that specifically. All of the alternative data collection methods that I mentioned have comparatively more limited reach than face-to-face interviewing. So they will have some sort of natural bias. You are prone to reach some people and not others. So some people might be underrepresented, but of course you may be specifically interested in populations who are hard to reach by phone. So, I mean, unfortunately, that is a limitation of phone surveying. Naturally, the other side must be reachable by phone, either because they have a phone or because they access to a phone can be arranged somehow. But just to speak beyond phone surveying a little bit, I mean, I understand we are all dealing with a very serious health crisis, but COVID-19, of course, was not the only problem in the world that we were all dealing with. Many programs in the world were looking to make a difference with some of the other world's, some of the rest of the world's leading problems. So that doesn't mean that people or implementers are suddenly letting themselves off the hook. Oh, there's a pandemic. Well, we better stay home. That isn't the answer at all. I mean, so another approach to this that we've been discussing, and others have too, is a way of still doing face-to-face, but in a way that limits the risk. So one of the ways to do that is to use embedded actors. And to give an example, let's say you are interested in tracking a certain vulnerable population who are sometimes clients of a certain local health clinic. Well, it might be possible for you to contact clinics like this and speak to people who live in these communities or nearby to see if there is anybody who is embedded in these spaces, who is already providing some necessary layer of service, who might be a potential source of the data that you need. This person might provide the opportunity to speak over the phone to the population that you're interested in. It might be that an activity that they're engaged in doubles up with what you're interested in doing. So that probably leaves a lot of questions unanswered, but there are, every situation is a little different. But I think we all need to think creatively about this. We all need to be careful at the same time that we're not asking anybody to take any irresponsible risks. But I mean, also just speaking realistically, I'm sure maybe others of you live in countries where there are segments of the population who cannot because of their lifestyle and because of the poverty that they live in, they cannot socially distance. It's not feasible in the way that it is in a more affluent part of the world. So that's also something to be realistic about in terms of the extent of additional risk that face-to-face activities actually do have. When you are looking to help people who are not really by circumstance able to socially distance. I mean, that doesn't say that there's no risk or that you can't make anything worse. You certainly can. But you do need to weigh up these risks with others, because just discontinuing other important work because we're dealing with this crisis isn't necessarily the right choice either. But thanks for the question. That's a really good question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I do realize that we have gone over in time, and we have a thank you for that from Abdulafiz, who asked the question. I realize we're over in time, so please stick with me if you can. If you can't, I understand, just because currently conducting and collecting data and surveys is such a pressing and important topic, especially now with COVID-19. So I want to continue and make sure we get to these last few questions. We've had a few from Cecilia and Lena about in regards to recording. So Cecile wants to know, because of recent circumstances, is it possible to request interviewees, beneficiaries to record facilitated focus groups, discussions, or theater presentations, or whatever activity is, and send the recording to the researcher / evaluator? That's the first question, and I'll repeat that if I need to. And the second question on recordings that we have is from Lena, and it says, what tools do you suggest that allow encryption of call recordings?
Okay, well, I love that second question in particular, but I won't skip your first question. So, okay, so firstly, yes, absolutely. I think it's possible to use embedded actors to help you collect both quantitative and qualitative data, including recordings of focus groups. I guess one of my concerns is, I mean, I've not done a lot of focus group interviewing, but I know moderation is really important, and inexperienced moderators may take a bit of time to generate the sort of engagement with the task at hand that's necessary. But I mean, these are tough times. We all need to make certain compromises, and I'm sure it's feasible to find people who are close to problems, both geographically and personally, who are able to perform these functions for you. But I mean, in terms of recording and transmitting data, I mean, these are all technically feasible things. It really just depends on the circumstances on the ground and what the people who are working as your agents are able to do, and what they have access to in terms of equipment and connectivity and services. But I mean, even on an Android phone, it's possible to use like on even like a $50 budget Android phone. You could make audio recordings which got synchronized to a Dropbox folder or similar. So all of that is very possible, but it involves some skills, some capacitation, and access, obviously, to internet services. Now, on encryption, thanks for mentioning that. Encryption is a cornerstone of data security, but it's also extremely important for the treatment of personally identifying information. at Dubility, it's our firm recommendation to everybody collecting PII that you treat it as sensitive and that you encrypt it and limit who has access to that information, especially when harm might come from exposing that information. So, I mean, just to go back to one of the things that I mentioned, if you are integrating into a voice API service like Twilio, Twilio is a great choice because they happen to support very robust private public key encryption. So what that means is when the recordings are saved on the Twilio server, they are saved in a encrypted format, which is unusable until you download the data and decrypt it, until you turn it into something useful. So it's a very high standard of security, but it's also a great way to make sure that your data is safe no matter what, no matter if Twilio systems are encrypted or are compromised in some ways. That's the only way to have peace of mind. But also just to connect your two questions, just as a suggestion. So in a very basic low resource situation, I mean, I was talking about uploading an audio file to a Dropbox folder. So products like Dropbox sometimes have supporting or third-party pieces of software that can help with encryption. So a popular one for Dropbox is a software platform called Boxcryptor. So crypto as in cryptography. So Boxcryptor also works with the Box storage platform and possibly Google Drive as well. I'm actually not sure about Google Drive, but basically Boxcryptor sets up folders in Google Drive selectively as encrypted spaces, which can be shared securely by a team. So it's a way of generally operating more securely. And Boxcryptor also works on mobile devices. So with the right training, you could look after that audio in a responsible way. But also, just lastly, I mean, depending on your choice of data collection software, like the survey tool itself, some survey tools have built-in encryption, which can protect audio. It happens to be one of the features that the Survey CTO platform has as well. But there are many options out there that can do these things for you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I don't want to go over 2 or 3 more minutes max, but okay. I do have 2 more questions that I'll throw at you really quick.
Great.
Yes. So we have one question from Mariana Neves. Have you done surveys with a slip sample using 2 methods? For instance, half CAPI CAPI and half CADI CATI? That's the first question. I'll pose the second if you don't mind as well. What approach used to triangulate data? And that is from Zumrat Samor-Bikova, and apologies again on pronunciation.
Great. I just want to clarify that I got the first question in particular. Have I heard of cases of using CAPI and CATI in a complementary way?
Yeah, surveys. Surveys with a slip sample using 2 different methods. So yes, for example, those 2 together.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. I mean, an example comes to mind immediately, which was actually pre-COVID. An organization I'm familiar with called Neuro Health in India. One of their programs involved 2 phases. So their recruitment phase was a face-to-face interview that typically happened at a hospital waiting room. And they happened to have a phone survey component as well to complement, which essentially checked up on adherence to advice that was provided during the consultation that was received. So the one would seed the other. So like a case was created to follow up on, which also established a series of calls to follow up with over time. Now, that's just one example. There are lots of configurations as well. I mean, hypothetically, you might use random digit dialing inside a country looking for respondents, even trying to find people to interview face-to-face at a later stage, if that made sense for the project. But I think the other way around makes most sense in most cases. But immediately across those two phases, I mean, you have the beginnings of triangulation. You have an initial set of data about the respondent, and later calls could be done by the initial interviewer, but they could also be done by other team members. And it's also possible to have a third party, like a back checker or another quality control team member who gets in touch with the respondent just to double check on some of the points that you happen to have. But I feel that with enough points of contact, especially longitudinally, it's possible to triangulate a number of points. But also, if you recall, I'd mentioned SMS as both a complement but also a data collection method. SMS and self-reporting can also be part of a strategy for collecting data over time and also confirming it. There really are some great options out there if you want to get another mode going. I mean, I didn't mention it in my slides, but I know some organizations are playing around with instant messaging bots. So you might, for example, recruit over the phone or in person, and then introduce a beneficiary or a respondent to an instant messaging chatbot on WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger or whatever the obvious choice is for that world region. So I hope that helps a little bit in terms of answering your question there.
Thank you very much. We did have a last minute question come in from Pablo Pastor. We don't have time to answer it, unfortunately, because we're already 15 minutes over. But Pablo, I'll make sure that Amrit gets the question and we'll hopefully be able to respond to you personally after this webinar. So I want to thank everyone for sticking with us today for this slightly longer than average Thursday talk. Because we had really important questions being asked on a topic that's very timely. I also want to say a special thank you to Amrit Cooper today, and for everyone again for joining us. This recording and additional helpful website links will be posted online on the M&E Thursday Talk discussion page later today so that you are able to return to it and share it with your colleagues. Also, feel free to continue the discussion online in the comments section. So that's it today. We'll be back next Thursday, the 13th, with another M&E Thursday Talk. We'll be discussing the business case for optimizing program impact through embedded monitoring systems. So we're going back to our M&E roots pretty strongly next week. This will be with John Bellish and Lindsay Hagar of One Earth Future Foundation. So we look forward to that discussion and hope you can join us next week. I am going to end on that note. And again, a special thank you to Rick for today. And I hope you all have the rest of your Thursday. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks all. Bye.